Welcome, friends, and happy Mother's Day to you all. Today is the day when we remember our mothers, who are the manifestation of the Divine Mother, the Supreme God. And she is most manifested in mothers, and also she is manifested in all men, those who have motherly heart. And one such man was Buddha, who treated all of the human beings as loved them as mother loves her child, and wanted them to show the right path when the people have forgotten the path to joy, path to blessedness. They had in fact forgotten the kernel and were just holding on to the shaft of the grain, rituals, sacrifice, external worship, and purity of heart was forgotten. Only those were the things that were all being taken care of. Purity of heart, the endeavor to transform our own self, reach the spiritual heights, attain the highest bliss, realize the truth. All those were forgotten, and Buddha said, look here, what you are doing is not the right path. This is the right path. We had Buddha Purnima last Sunday, and very next Sunday today we have someone who is going to speak on Buddhism and its most important part of the Buddhism, transformation of heart and mind. Many of you know Marco Mascairn. He practices Buddhism, has met Dalai Lama, and has got the initiation into Buddhism from Tibetan tradition. And to introduce him formally, Marco Mascairn combines training in fine arts, counseling, spirituality, and eco-theology at the University of Toronto, with more than 20 years of Indo-Tibetan Buddhist practice and training in India and North America. His work is focused on protecting, preserving, and promoting the values and insights of traditional wisdom, cultures, and practices. Currently, he serves as Buddhist chaplain at the University of Toronto's Multi-Faith Center and coordinates and co-directs the Institute of Traditional Medicine, where he develops educational forums and presentations on health and spirituality. Marco is a lead faculty of the Interprofessional Certificate of Applied Mindfulness Meditation, University of Toronto, and coordinator of the Mindfulness Workshops for Health Sciences, McMaster University. Marco has written and produced dozens of nationally broadcast documentary films for the CBC about spirituality and contemporary visionaries. He is currently completing his PhD in Creative Systemic Studies. We are very fortunate to have Marco as a speaker here today, and we welcome Marco to give a talk on Buddhism, transformation of heart and mind. Marco, let's go.
Good morning, everyone. Very pleased to be here, and I think appropriately just a week after you celebrated Buddha Purnima. So I spoke to Swamiji about speaking about Buddhism in the context of transformation, transforming the mind and heart. So before I do that, what is traditionally done in the lineage that I've been taught is before we do any kind of practice, meditation, or even a talk, we start with taking refuge. So I'm going to do that. I learned it in the Tibetan language, and then I'll do, we traditionally do it 3 times, and the last time I'll do it in English so you can hear what it is I'm saying. Sanje chodan soki chognam la chengju bardu dadi kapsuchi daji jin soji peso namki drola benchir sanje ju parsho Sanje chodan soki chognam la chengju bardu dadi kapsuchi daji jin soji peso namki drola benchir sanje ju parsho I go for refuge to Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha until I attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So last week, as you celebrated Buddha Purnima, celebrating a life that was lived 2,500 years ago in northern India, and often I remark or comment on how remarkable it is that 2,500 years later, the Buddha's teachings have spread all over the world and are just as relevant today, for human beings today, as they were 2,500 years ago. And I think one of the great gifts of the Buddhist tradition is teachings on the mind. And whenever we talk about the mind and suffering, we are in universal territory. In other words, all human beings have minds, consciousness, and we all suffer. So 2,500 years ago, when the Buddha lived, his teaching was distilled into the Four Noble Truths, which I'm sure most, certainly many of you have heard. And in those Four Noble Truths contained the entire body of the Buddha's teaching. So today what I wanted to do was speak about those teachings, and in the context of how do the Four Noble Truths address the notion of transforming the mind and transforming the heart? So the papers that I had Swamiji make copies of for you, I'll be making reference to them. I just wanted to start by reading a quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who I'm sure all of you have heard of. And his quote at the top of the page, in a very succinct way, addresses this notion of the importance of the mind. Because whatever the religious tradition is, we are concerned with generating compassion, patience, kindness, wisdom. And so whenever we're talking about generating those attributes, of course we're talking about working with the mind. So here's a quote from His Holiness. There are two reasons why it is important to understand the nature of mind. One is because there's an intimate connection between mind and karma. The other is that our state of mind plays a crucial role in our experience of happiness and suffering. I think we would probably all agree with that. Now what's curious is that the Four Noble Truths are translated as truths. Just yesterday I was giving a talk at the University of Toronto, and I made note that these were not the four possibilities or the four maybes or the four what ifs, but the four truths. And what the Buddha articulated was four truths about the nature of human life. So we start with that human life has suffering, dukkha, dissatisfaction. Now yesterday it was curious because a number of people had real difficulty with that. They said, well, there's happiness in life, and I enjoy things, and of course, the Buddha did not refute or deny that. But what Buddha did was addressed what is the nature of the reality that we live in. And again, in the realm of truths, none of us could deny that the reality that we live within is one that is impermanent, is one that is always changing, one that is insubstantial. And in fact, if we were to take, whether it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a few hours, to try to imagine something that didn't change, is there anything in your experience, your own what we refer to in the Buddhist tradition, your 5 skandhas, pancha skandhas, your 5 aggregates, or in the objects in this room or outside of this room? Is there anything that doesn't change, that remains permanent? And the Buddha's clear insight into that was that no, there is nothing that does not change, that is not substantial, that does not exist independently from its own side. And so given that that's the case, the question would be, how does one live with that recognition? Not living with that recognition means that one would quite possibly live with a lot of suffering. In other words, when we look at the Four Noble Truths, it's important to look at them as a whole, not just as life is suffering. And often in the Western world, people hear the first Noble Truth and they don't want to hear the rest of them. Certainly you can do better than that. Life is suffering. But as I said, looking at all of them together, life is suffering. But most importantly, there's a cause for suffering. And what is that cause? In the Buddhist tradition, the cause is referred to as tanha, grasping, clinging. That clinging is based on ignorance, based on a fundamental misperception that we can achieve lasting happiness by materials and objects that are fundamentally impermanent. So you can see that there is, it's the word that's used today, a disconnect, an incongruity between wanting permanent happiness from objects that are impermanent. This is one of Buddha's profound insights. So first there is suffering. Suffering because, second noble truth, everything is subject to change, and we tend to, as human beings, cling to objects, hoping that they will bring us lasting happiness. And we all know, even though we might know it, that that creates suffering. Cause of suffering. And then here's the good news, the third and fourth noble truth, is that there's a cessation. There is an end to suffering. There's a way out of suffering. Then the fourth noble truth is the path, the Eightfold Noble Path. How does one begin to decrease suffering in one's life? And what we have in the Eightfold Noble Path is a prescription for a life well lived. The prescription for a life lived with the knowing and with the reality, with the recognition that all things are impermanent and all things change. So the Buddha articulated this, and I'm going to draw your attention now to the first page here, Four Noble Truths, and then just midway, the Eightfold Noble Path and the 3 higher trainings. I think that often my experience has been that the Eightfold Noble Path, that not as much time is spent looking at the various components of the Eightfold Noble Path. And really, as I said, the response to, or the response to the question, how do we decrease suffering, is embedded in the Eightfold Noble Path. How do we live a life where we can begin to transform the mind? So here's Buddha's prescription. What was done with the teachings is divide them into 3 sections or categories, if you will. And you'll notice there on the right side, wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental development. And what I'd like you to do is think about the Eightfold Noble Path in the context of how does one transform the mind? What would the ingredients be? What would the requirements be if one wanted to transform the mind from one of unwholesome thoughts and activity to one of wholesomeness, compassion, kindness, and wisdom? So, Buddha's prescription, first, and although in the teaching, often ethical conduct, it's always articulated this way, and the teachings are not, the Eightfold Noble Path is not necessarily done one by one, but really simultaneously. And so if you think about it, in order to work with the mind, first of all, we have to have ethical conduct. If we've been engaged in negative activity, stealing or gossip, our mind is always active. We're always thinking about, well, what if I get caught? Or what if somebody finds out? Or that agitates the mind. So before we even begin to meditate, before we start working with the mind directly, we need to have a basis of ethical conduct. For lay practitioners, it would be the 5 precepts. Not taking life, not engaging in sexual misconduct or intoxications, not lying, and not stealing. So those are the 5 basic moral precepts that lay practitioners, Buddhists, engage in. And I think we would find that as a common feature in any religion. For those people who are monks and nuns, there's many more. But you can look at all of those different rules and guidelines as a way to work with the mind, to keep the mind focused, to keep the mind pure. So we have that as the basis. Then, what we start to do is work with concentrated practices. So you'll see mental development, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. How do we start working with the mind so that it is, as one contemporary Buddhist teacher has said, the mind is serviceable. We can work with it. We are not plagued with what in the tradition is referred to as monkey mind, that agitated mind. And how many of us can relate to that experience of the monkey mind or the many stories that go through our mind throughout the day. And then we're kind of taken out of that trance. So what we're seeing now in North America is the proliferation of mindfulness practices in hospitals, in clinical work with psychotherapists. The work I do at the university is largely teaching social workers, psychotherapists. You see mindfulness used in prisons, palliative care. And really what mindfulness is, if we were to look at it in the context of the Buddhist tradition, it would be here under mental development. Right effort in order to work with the mind. The effort to decrease negative thoughts, negative actions, negative behavior. Right mindfulness, and the tradition is translated in Sanskrit is sati, non-forgetfulness. Now how does that relate to the notion of mindfulness? So the idea is that in mindfulness practice, in what we refer to shamatha, calm abiding, how do we make the mind serviceable? So the practice of mindfulness or shamatha is to take an object. Most often it's the breath, and we place the awareness on the breath, the rising and falling of the abdomen, for example, with each breath. What we're doing with that practice over time, maybe we do 20 minutes a day or an hour a day, what we're doing over time is building the capacity to keep the mind focused and concentrated. So that when we're distracted by thoughts and feelings and sensations, we simply bring the mind back. What that does is it makes the mind, as I used the term before, serviceable, so that we can start using it to look very deeply, look in a penetrating way into the nature of reality, into the nature of phenomena. When we're able to do that, we're then in the wisdom practices. You'll see at the top there, right view and right intention. So in order to practice what's referred to as vipassana, insight, clear seeing, one first of all has to develop the foundations through samadhi, through concentration. Once the mind is able to be focused, it can then be directed towards looking at such phenomena as impermanence, anicca, or non-self, anatta, looking at the very nature of existence. So those three practices work together. We have the ethical foundation, and then based on that, we cultivate the concentrated practices of meditation, mental development, and then based on that, we're able to use the mind for insight. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, you may have seen the beautiful tankas and paintings of different Buddha figures. The embodiment, or personification, if you will, of the Buddha of wisdom is Manjushri. And Manjushri is often depicted with a sword in his hand. Now, of course, this is not a sword to cut or to make injury, but rather a sword to cut through ignorance, to cut at the very root of suffering. So the cultivation of wisdom is intended to get to the very root of why human beings suffer, ignorance and grasping. Now what I'm going to do is ask you just to turn your page over, and what you'll see there at the top is a circle. I've referred to it there as the 12 links of dependent origination, in Sanskrit pratitya samutpada, the 12 nidanas. If you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see a Tibetan tanka, the 6 states, the wheel of life. Although it's a small depiction, you'll get a sense of this wrathful-looking character. It's the Tibetan depiction of Yama, the Lord of Death. And that circle is referred to as samsara, the endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth that we're all subject to. And we're subject to as long as we are subject to ignorance. So, I just want to illustrate this image so that we have some sense of how it works. And what I'd like to do is draw your attention to the very center. Now, it's hard to see in the upper part. So if you look on your lower left hand, you'll see 3 animals. And it's the pig, the rooster, and the snake. Those three images are the very heart of the wheel of samsara. And why is that? Because, as I said, it is ignorance that turns the entire wheel of suffering. So first we have the pig, and if you look closely, you'll see out of the mouth of the pig arises the rooster, representing greed, representing that tenacious grasp that we hold on the notion of ourselves as a permanent, separate entity, the grasping that we place on objects of desire, material objects. And then, in the grasp of the rooster, is the snake, representing hatred. So these three functions of ignorance, greed, and hatred are what turn that whole wheel. And in the theme of how do we begin to decrease suffering, well, it's there that we have to address our attention. How do we cut through ignorance? How does Manjushri use his sword skillfully to get to the heart of that? And as I said, in the context of the Eightfold Noble Path, through making the mind serviceable. First, being able to concentrate the mind, and then using the mind to penetrate into the nature of reality. On the outer circumference of this depiction of the three animals, you'll see that we have human beings descending and then ascending. The notion of the human beings descending are people who have indulged in negative activity throughout their life and have created samskaras, have created grooves, if you will, in their mind that cause them, in the Buddhist tradition, it's referred to as throwing karma. Karma that propels them into another incarnation that will, in effect, people will experience the fruits of their actions. So, thus we have people descending into the lower realms, the hell realms, as you'll see, the world of pretas, which is the hungry ghost realm, and the world of animals. Now, the good thing about karma is that everything's workable. In other words, if one does, through their negative actions, suffer the consequences of it, which is inevitable, there's still the opportunity to decrease the karmic implications. And, as we see on the left hand, ascend into the higher realms, if you will. Most of the time when teachers in the West talk about the six realms, they talk about a psychological capacity. And so, in other words, not places that you go, but rather states of mind that you experience. So, for example, if you're always operating out of base emotions, it would be as though to live in the world of animals. If that's all you're doing is satiating your sensual needs and desires, you'd be living in that kind of animal realm. Or the world of the pretas, the hungry ghost. Those of us who have such greed that we're never satisfied. So the way it's depicted in the Tonkas, and you can't see it in the right, but in a larger depiction, you'll see these beings with very long necks and bloated bellies. So they might be surrounded by incredible abundance, riches, and beautiful food, but they can never have enough. So the image is a little mouth, a long, thin neck, and bloated bellies. And they're always trying to take more and more food, but unsuccessfully, never being able to nourish themselves. And that is not unlike how some people live their lives here. So hence we can see the psychological dimension of that in this life. Now, I want to bring your attention to the outer circumference. It's a little difficult to see, but I'll go through them. What we have there is, it's referred to as the 12 nidanas, the 12 interdependent links. And that was Buddha's articulation of how does ignorance turn the entire wheel of samsara. But not only that, how we can turn the wheel the other way so that we decrease and ultimately terminate or bring suffering to a cessation. Generally, when this is taught, it's taught in the context of three lives. The karma that we incur from previous incarnations. So first of all, based on ignorance, we imprint, in the Buddhist tradition referred to as the mind stream, with karmic seeds, samskaras. When we have ignorance, and based on ignorance, those samskaras, we have the consequences in rebirth. So you'll notice there, number 3 is consciousness, but usually it's articulated as rebirth consciousness. So the first two links are from a previous incarnation. We have ignorance, we have samskaras, and we have the cause for rebirth, throwing karma, karma that throws us into a new incarnation. So rebirth consciousness is 3, and then 4 is nama and rupa, rupa form. So nama and rupa have to do with, I'm trying to think of the best translation. Well, it would be the samskaras. Or not the samskaras, but the skandhas, the 5 skandhas. So rather than look at the self as a whole, Buddhism says if we look at it moment to moment, the self is not permanent and independent, but rather it's made up of a congealing of different qualities and components. There's consciousness in every moment of awareness, of course. There's feeling. We like, we dislike. We're neutral towards something. Form, feeling, perception, so we perceive that which is around us. And when we have all those elements congealed, we have what appears to be a permanent self. But this is when we begin to meditate moment by moment. We see that the self is not as independent and permanent as it appears to be. For example, we sit for even 5 minutes. Thoughts come up, feelings come up. And we begin to notice that what appeared to be a monolithic, solid, permanent self is made of components coming together constantly, moment to moment. So we have the 5 skandhas, and based on that, we have the 6 sense organs. So if we look at the previous incarnation, 1 and 2, giving cause for rebirth, and then of course when we have rebirth, we have the 5 skandhas coming together, we have the 6 sense organs, and then we move to contact, number 6. So if we have the 5 skandhas, if we have the 6 sense organs, we're able to make contact with the world of form around us. Now here's where we begin to produce more karma. Based on contact, so for example, the simple example would be looking at this painting here. I have my 6 sense organs, 5 sense organs, mental consciousness. I make contact with the beautiful image, the painting up here. And then we have feeling. Now feeling in the Buddhist tradition is very specific because it's something that we like, we don't like, or we feel neutral towards. And when we feel craving towards something, then we move on to number 8, craving. We begin to develop desire, grasping, and this is what turns the whole wheel. So I want to bring your attention to between number 7 and number 8. Number 7 is the result of previous imprints, if you will, previous samskaras. Number 9, craving, is when we begin to create new karma because we turn the wheel again out of our suffering and grasping. So here, number 8 and number 9, first we have craving, which can be, for example, let's say someone is a smoker and they're trying to quit. The craving might be a mental phenomenon. Oh, I could really use another cigarette. But the craving often, and most often, turns to grasping. In other words, without even thinking, the person's smoking a cigarette. I'm not a smoker, but I've talked to people who have quit, and without even thinking about it, they'll have a cigarette limp. Oh, I don't even know how you did that. So that's a notion of craving that's so extreme that it just bypasses our ability to intervene and change it. Now, based on number 8, craving and clinging, we have the cause for rebirth. So you'll see number 10 and number 11 and number 12, we have rebirth consciousness again, becoming, birth, old age, death, and we're back into the whole cycle. Now, you could look at that and say, well, it's kind of bleak. I mean, it just keeps turning, and where do we get off the merry-go-round, the Ferris wheel? Well, this is where the practice, on the other side of the page there, this is where the practices of ethical conduct, mental development, and wisdom come in. In other words, how do we work with the mind? Because what's possible in that circle of samskara is an opportunity to change, to shift, to do things differently. In other words, some of the same desires may come up, but we have the opportunity to not go with them, to not feed them, to not turn the wheel of samsara. So I want to now draw your attention to number 7 and number 8. So we have sensations or feeling, but if we've trained the mind, if we've worked with the mind, we don't have to turn it into craving and then grasping or clinging or becoming or birth or old age. So it's at that point in the wheel of samsara that we have an opportunity to change, to do something differently. Buddhism would say that the way that we are able to do that is we have a mind that we have trained through mental development, through ethical conduct, and through wisdom. And based on that, we can not fuel the wheel of samsara. So you can see that there's a cohesiveness to all these ideas. Often when people are introduced to Buddhist ideas, they hear about karma, they hear about samsara, they hear about emptiness, shunyata. But I think it's very important to look at a model like this, look at the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Path, the 12 links of interdependent origination, and have a sense of how they all fit together. For example, how does karma relate to the wheel here? How does it turn? Well, we recognize that by creating karma, we turn that wheel. Often, for people who are new to the notion of karma, I explain that karma is not fatalistic, but rather it allows us the opportunity to change things, that everything is workable, that we can work with the mind, that we can work with our relationship to objects and phenomena. So what I've done here in a very short period of time is attempted to distill 2,500 years. There's so much to the teaching, but what I wanted to do in the short period of time that we had together today was give you just a very quick sense of the core of Buddhist teachings. And when I spoke to Swamiji originally about coming and doing this teaching, I thought that if I spoke about the mind and how the mind can be transformed, that's something that has a universal resonance. Because as I said when I first started this morning, was to say that when we talk about suffering, when we talk about the mind, we're talking about all human beings. So in other words, these teachings, as are the teachings of the Upanishads and the Vedas, are as relevant 2,500 years ago, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, as they are today. And in some ways, how remarkable that is. Because if you look at other areas of human endeavor, there's not many that we can point to and say they're still as relevant 2,500 years ago, or 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, as they are today. And so I see the growth of mindfulness and how remarkable that is, that these teachings are entering all these different spheres of contemporary society and still just as relevant. We're still struggling with working with, how do we work with the mind? Having grown up in the Western world and being trained in psychotherapy, I would say that the West's means and modes of intervention, when compared to some of the sophistication of the Buddhist tradition, the Sanatana Dharma, I think there's so much to learn from these ancient traditions. And I hope that that's what's happening. We're seeing that in mindfulness practice where neuroscientists are saying, well, this is fascinating. Now they're able to wire people up, literally, if you've ever seen the pictures, and look at what's happening neurologically when people are meditating. Quite incredible. So you can imagine my surprise as a Buddhist practitioner when I first started hearing about meditation as an intervention. I thought, how curious, what do you mean an intervention? Well, it's used by clinicians and it's being used psychotherapeutically. And one of the reasons it's had such traction and such interest in contemporary society is because scientists have weighed in and said, well, something's going on. Neurologically, we can see something's happening. So there's this conversation that's happened. But here's the curious thing for me, and that is that for 2,500 years, Buddhist practitioners of the Sanatana Dharma, the Vedanta, have known about the validity, have known about the efficacy of these teachings by virtue of doing them, by virtue of our own minds. So I would say that my confidence, so to speak, in these teachings comes from experience. Now, it's certainly useful that in the Western world we have science to validate, but I think for many of us here today, the validation comes through our own experience. And I hope that in this conversation that's begun to happen, that we will begin to honor the introspective, the subjective experience, and the capacity that we have to actually transform the mind. So I see that we're in a very important historical period where there has begun a conversation between science and these ancient traditions. Because when it comes to the Western world, talking psychotherapeutically, I don't know that we have really excelled in how to transform the mind. Certainly we can identify pathology, we have psychotherapeutic interventions, But one of the reasons why I've seen mindfulness grow so remarkably is that I think that people see it as a tool that gives people a way to directly work with their minds, which is so remarkable. And again, 2,500 years later, the teachings are just as relevant as they were. They're just as relevant today as they were back then. So, just in the remaining moments, I just want to open up the floor here. If anyone has any questions or inquiries, I'm more than happy to address them. And if not, I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me the opportunity to come and speak with you. I've been to the temple here before, and I always enjoyed being here. And I also wanted to say that my association with Vedanta and knowing Swamiji and learning the teachings of the Upanishads, I would have to say that it is one of the studies I have undertaken that has deeply affected my study and understanding of Buddhism. And one thing that I say when I have the opportunity to speak in interfaith context is I really encourage people to learn about other faith traditions. So I'll tell people, if you have someone at your workplace, you're a Christian or Jewish, and you know somebody who's Muslim, take the opportunity to speak with them. I feel that my association with other religious traditions that it only deepens my practice of Buddhism. And to know about the beautiful articulations of reality in the Upanishads, in the Vedanta, has really served to deepen, as I said, how I understand Buddhism. Now, we can talk about emptiness, or we can talk about that God is all things. And I think, for the most part, we're dealing with linguistic differences. And when we get to the core truths, I think it's quite easy to agree that we're working with the same thing. Again, as I started off by saying this morning, working with the mind, working with the heart, and working with decreasing suffering. I think on that we would all agree. So again, yes, we have a question here. Yeah.
Mr. Mascairn, I wonder whether you could explain this second.
Oh, okay, sure.
A little more.
Okay, so just to draw your attention, this is on the second page, or the other side of the page. At the top it says Tibetan Tankas. And so this is a traditional depiction of what you're seeing on top there. So this is an image that would be on monastery walls, almost like a fresco painted on the walls. And it would serve as a reminder of the 6 realms, the 12 links, and the 3 roots of suffering. So it's more difficult to see because it's a small image. But the very center of this image is right here, the 3 animals. The very outside of the circumference is the descending into the lower realms. On the other side, we have the ascension into the realms of... And by the way, where's the best possible realm to be? Most people would say, well, the realms of bliss, of course. The world of the gods. But in fact, in Buddhism, it's said that the human realm is the best realm to be in. So, congratulations, here we are. The human realm being the best realm, because we have the opportunity to actually understand the mechanisms of suffering and decrease suffering. So the human realm is the realm in which we can directly address karma, and in the context of this particular circle, we can start to turn the wheel of samsara back or around. So the image, as you pointed out or asked about, the ferocious deity is Yama. We are subject, Yama is the personification of death. We are subject to, and we are in the fangs of death, inasmuch as we are subject to samsara. But of course in Buddhism, Noble Truth 3 and Noble Truth 4 provide the promise that there's a way out of suffering. There's cessation, and there's the Eightfold Noble Path as a way out of suffering. Did that answer the question? Okay. Any other questions? So again, thank you all very much, and it's been a pleasure to be here, and I wish your center every success. I think the work that you're doing is so important, and I do hope that these teachings, whether they're Buddhist teachings or teachings from the Upanishads and the Vedanta, that they will begin to infiltrate more areas of society, because it's certainly true. All we have to do is look at the paper to see what the results are of not having access to these teachings. So, again, thank you very much.